Ghosts, spirits, hauntings, they whisper along the lines between truth and myth, tantalizing us with their possibilities. Some people swear to have encountered the spirits of the dead, while others firmly believe this is impossible. Regardless of what the truth is, the concept of ghosts binds us together, intertwining our past and future together in a fascinating way. The possibility of a spiritual life represents the human desire to touch and to understand the afterlife, such as it may be. A good ghost story can scare, enthrall, and connect us to nameless people who lived 100 years ago. Helps us to understand the life they lived and the hardships they've endured. In this video series, we are exploring some of the strangest and the most enduring ghost stories of our local area. A full moon lights up the night sky above the unincorporated community of Mako in North Carolina. The year is 1957, and you and your friends are looking for proof of a ghost. This October, Life magazine published an article about famous ghost stories, and one of them caught your eye. The illustration showed a ghostly figure carrying a lantern. According to the story, many people who travel to Mako are visited by the spirit of a dead train conductor swinging his light down the tracks. Records can't agree on the identity of the ghost, let alone the truth of a story. The mystery drew you in, so you decided to visit Mako. You stumble through thick vegetation overhung by tall, shadowy trees. Nearby Hood Creek burbles softly, harmonizing with the chirping of the crickets. The undergrowth thins, and you find yourself standing next to your goal, a railroad track. Silvery rails glimmer in the moonlight, stretching away in either direction. A trestle bridge stands nearby, carrying the track across Hood Creek towards Goldsboro. Occasionally cars drive down Mako Road, or Route 74, casting yellow light through the trees. You turn off your flashlight, letting your eyes get used to the faint glow of the moon. For a long time, nothing happens, and you are starting to feel foolish. Then your friend grabs your arm. "Look," they whisper. A tiny yellow light flickers far down the track, so small you almost miss it. You shake your head. It's just a car headlight reflecting on the track. But you can't hear any cars. Is it an approaching train? The field stays silent, with no sounds of pumping pistons or screeching whistles. The light bobs up and down like a flashlight, but the flickering could only belong to a flame. It swings from one side of the track to another, gradually growing larger. There can be no doubt that it is coming towards you. You take a step back into the safety of the trees, watching the light weave and sway like it is trying to find something or trying to send a warning. What will you see if you got closer? Who would be holding the handle of the light, shining it on you? Even though you want to run away, you decide to walk down the track toward the light. Gravel crunches under your feet and the railroad ties creak. No matter how far you walk, the light doesn't get any closer. When you start jogging, trying to catch it, the light moves out into the field in an arc before disappearing, leaving you alone in the chilly night. As you go home with your friends, you feel more curious than satisfied. What was that light? Was it real? And why is there a ghost light on a railroad track in the middle of nowhere? You decide to explore the story behind the mysterious Maco Light. Since the light appears on a railroad track, it's not surprising that its story starts with the Wilmington and Manchester Railroad line, which stretches for 161 miles, starting in Wilmington and traveling north across the state of North Carolina. The line was opened in 1854, shortly before the Civil War. Trains were extremely important in the early United States. Stout black steam engines carried people and goods back and forth between states with much greater speed and volume than any other method. The development of the Transcontinental Railroad between 1863 and 1869 connected the East and West Coast, facilitating cross-country trade and the migration of Easterners to settle the wild state of California. but how did trains come to the U.S.? In England, coal mines used rudimentary train tracks to move their coal as early as 1600s. Soon, trains were chugging all over England. But the United States was a bigger challenge because of its size and rugged terrain, as well as not having as many factories to make train parts. A man named Colonel John Stevens founded the first railroad company in the United States, the New Jersey Railroad Company, in 1815. He invented a contraption he called a steam wagon, which ran around a small track on his property. It didn't look much like the trains we are used to seeing today. It more closely resembled a horse carriage without the horses. While his invention couldn't exactly haul freight across the country, it inspired other inventors and railway companies to work on their own steam engines. The West Point Foundry in New York eventually manufactured a train called the Best Friend of Charleston, the first steam locomotive design built entirely in the United States. On Christmas Day in 1830, the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company made U.S. railroad history by using the Best Friend of Charleston to carry paying customers for the first time. Now that steam engines were finally viable, Stevens was able to open the first line for his New Jersey Railroad Company in 1832. The railroad system exploded in size and popularity throughout the 1800s, with both freight and passenger trains becoming essential to the country's way of life. The Wilmington and Manchester line, like many Southern railroad lines, suffered during the Civil War. The Union relied on the robust railways in the northern states to carry troops and supplies. In turn, they deconstructed, damaged, or constricted railroads in the South as the fighting moved below the Mason-Dixon line. The W&M Railroad, which had expanded into South Carolina with a promise of revitalizing the area, lost their train depot in Manchester when the Northern troops systematically deconstructed the town, forcing the residents to leave. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the W&M Railroad line passed through the hands of several companies and broke into shorter sections. Unfortunately for Joe, another train was scheduled to follow immediately after his train. The poor man knew that he was just moments from a disaster. Instead of running away and saving himself, Joe grabbed his lantern from the decoupled car. Some stories say that he stood on the rear platform of the car, while others say that he climbed down onto the track. His hands probably shook from the cold and fear as he lifted the lantern, waiting to hear the chugging of another train. There it was, in a frantic attempt to prevent the accident. Joe waved his lantern as hard as he could. The flame swayed and bounced in the darkness, bobbing along the track, but the lantern was just too small, and the conductor of the next train was not looking out for anything unusual. Joe's place in history ended just as quickly as it began, when the two trains collided in a devastating roar of twisting metal. According to the story, poor Joe was not just killed, but decapitated. The crews who came to clean up the wreck found Joe's body, but they could not locate the head. A witness claimed that a mysterious force had flung the head away from the wreck. They assumed it had rolled into the thick vegetation, sunk in a swampy area, or been taken by an animal. Instead of mimicking the selfishness of the men running the railroad, this brave conductor gave his life in an attempt to save the lives on the other train. When people investigated, no person or sign of any person could be found. "It's Joe Baldwin," the residents whispered to each other. "He's come to search for his head." People from the town began to go to the tracks on purpose, looking for the light or searching among the bushes for some kind of skull. Those who were lucky enough to see the light said that it usually appeared far away, barely a prick of yellow in the darkness. It bobbed and weaved toward the tracks, swaying in the same way a lantern might when dangling from the hand of an anxious train conductor. When it reached the tracks, it would follow them for a while, retreating the same ground where Joe's train car was destroyed. Some eager ghost hunters would try to run toward the light, desperate to get a glimpse of the person or creature who held it. To their disappointment, the light would fall back or disappear across the field. Did Joe really carry the lantern? Was he headless or whole? The questions drove people crazy, but the persistent mysteriousness of the lantern bearer just made the legend even more popular. People disagreed through the years about the brightness and quality of the light. Some stated likely thinking of the lantern that Joe waved out of the train, that it was small, faint, and had the quality of a flame. Others claimed to see a light that was more similar in brightness and quality to a 25-watt light bulb. Still others suggested it shone even brighter, casting reflections on the rails. For the first few years after the Maco Light's first sighting, most people claimed to see two lights on the track moving in tandem. After a large earthquake in 1886 that shook nearby Charleston, the lights vanished temporarily. When the light appeared again, it was a single light. No one thereafter reported seeing two lights like before the earthquake. This casts interesting questions about what might be causing the lights. The light appeared so frequently that railroad operations in the area began to encounter problems. Well-meaning conductors would stop their trains in the middle of nowhere for no reason. When questioned, they claimed that they had been signaled by a lantern on the desolate stretch of the track near Mako. Even if the railroad managers didn't believe in ghosts, they couldn't deny how many trains were affected by the phenomenon. They considered how to address the problem and agreed that signalmen at Mako should use two signal lights at all times, one red and one green. This way, conductors could ignore any single yellow lights in the area. President Grover Cleveland got to hear the story of the Maco Light when he rode a train past Mako in 1889 and asked about the reason for the two lights. Joe probably never guessed that a president would be listening to his story. Through the years, the legend of the Maco Light spread like wildfire and ignited the imagination of the entire country. Tourists and journalists would travel to Mako to do their best to encounter the light for themselves. When they failed, publications often concocted their own sensational images to go with their articles. Even throughout the 1900s, America didn't forget about Joe and his eternal wandering. It became quite popular to sit near the tracks at night and watch for the light. The tiny community of Mako, barely a few houses and a store, became the site of one of the best documented and easily spotted ghosts in the country. Some visitors brought equipment they hoped would illuminate the ghost behind the lantern. Several newspaper photographers and even a ghost hunter photographed the light, claiming to see shapes and reflections of light that suggested a human figure. However, their evidence is blurry, vague, and inconclusive. In 1962, 4 electronics engineers from radio stations and labs in Raleigh and Charlotte brought cameras, a spectroscope, and an audio amplifier to the scene. A spectroscope analyzes the wavelengths of light, providing information on its source. The engineers hoped that the spectroscope could prove what was casting the light, whether it was Joe's kerosene lamp or something more mundane like marsh gas or a car headlight reflecting. Unfortunately, the lack of information about their findings indicates that the answer wasn't as straightforward as they hoped. In 1964, a famous parapsychologist named Hans Holzer, who wrote hundreds of books and plays on supernatural and occult topics, was flown from New York to Mako to investigate the light. After witnessing the phenomenon, he concluded not only that it was real, but that Joe was not in fact searching for his head. Holzer theorized that Joe's spirit didn't even realize he was dead. The faithful conductor still believed that his car was sitting on the tracks. Trapped in an endless cycle of trying to warn oncoming trains, Joe waves his light night after night. This somewhat depressing theory, among many other stories, helped fuel Holzer's 1972 book, The Phantoms of Dixie. Exactly 100 years after the Maco Light came into being, the railroad removed the track running near Mako. The trestle bridge over Hood Creek was destroyed, leaving nothing but a line of sawed-off logs protruding from the babbling brook. The line became nothing but a long, flat strip carved out of the encroaching trees, tall grass disguising where the track once lay. And along with the track, Joe Baldwin vanished. Not a single person could find the ghost light from that day onward. Had the spirit gone to rest? We will never know. Some questions and skepticism have been aimed at the Maco Light and even the story of Joe Baldwin. By the 70s, quite a few investigators agreed that a bend in the nearby Route 74 highway was creating a unique refraction of passing headlights. Lights of similar color had been observed much closer to the highway, clearly caused by the phenomenon in question. Supporters of this theory pointed out that the light became more scarce since the highway had been widened in the 60s, changing the direction of the roadway slightly. In response to this, locals argued that the light had still appeared during the 1940s when the highway was closed for a time. Records, however, do not indicate any such closure. Frustrations mounted between the residents of Mako, who loved their local ghosts, and skeptics who tried to refute it. The true answer has never been found, and now that the track is gone, probably never will be. One final problem haunts the story of Joe Baldwin, the problem of history. An employee of the Wilmington Railroad Museum named James Burke pointed out that there are no historical records of Joe ever having existed. This alone isn't proof. Millions of everyday people who lived and died peacefully have no historical record to mark their names. However, the story got a bit stranger when Burke realized that there was no record of a railroad accident in the Mako area in 1867. The closest accident he could find took place near Hood's Creek in 1856, 11 years before the Maco Light story. One man died in this accident, the conductor, Charles Baldwin. That's right, this confirmed historical figure shared his name with the protagonist of the Ghost Light story. In the 1856 accident, the train engine intentionally decoupled itself from the rest of the train to work out a problem with the pumps. When it returned to pick up its cars, the engine collided with the rest of the train. It was a much smaller accident than the one in Maco Light story. damaging one car and injuring the man inside slightly, but the conductor, Charles, was thrown out of the train and sustained a fatal head injury. When the incident went to court, the jury determined that Charles had failed to hang a lantern from the end of the train to alert the engineer driving the engine. Unfortunately, this one mistake left Charles in great pain before dying several days later. His obituary suggests that he was well liked in the Wilmington community, perhaps allowing his name to live on. Charles Baldwin's story casts a very interesting twist on the Joe Baldwin story. Did Joe Baldwin ever exist, or was he formed as a fictional memorial to Charles? Could it be possible for two men named Baldwin to die in a lantern-related train accident in the same spot in the span of 10 years? Stranger things have happened, but we will likely never know the answer. This leads us to wonder who might be carrying the ghostly light that transfixed so many people for a century. Could it be Joe, Charles, or someone or something entirely different? Or is the light carried by a simple reflection of some car headlights? Such a complex and mysterious story, along with such an enduring ghost, makes for the best kind of spooky story. Whether or not Joe existed, or whether his ghost walked the tracks, he holds an important part of the South story. His self-sacrifice and commitment to his job represent the type of person we all wish to be. He also embodies the exciting, dangerous world of early railroad history. His haunting of a tiny, rural community centers the excitement and fascination of an entire country into the one of the most enthralling ghost stories of the South.
Subscribe now.